work on the world around you. Ingest it. Drink the world. What happens when the world hits you? Isn't a cry the sovereign proof of freedom? I am free to speak, to react, to be effective about the world. There is a special connection going on between the world and the I when I speak. When I say things nobody ever said, while surrounded by things that have always existed. Is this a flow? What is this flow? I've been covering up the word. This is improvisation when I speak freely. It's too much of a complex word for what it actually entails. Let's preferably call it poetry, though calling it won't make it come round. Poetry, in a way, makes us the template of nature, and nature becomes the template of human experience. One may find many theories about this, how poetry is about the correspondence between experience and reality, of the mutual enhancement between these two categories. I wouldn't want to put any timestamps over this specific topic, even though one would have the tendency of pinpointing it to aesthetic theories of Einfühlung or Théorie de l'affect, which were reigning over the 18th century. The 18th century informed our view of the world right up until today, though we have a bit of a problem. Despite those revolutions in thought, no revolutions in art were made sensible to their own age. Art seems to have started to have picked up in the 19th century what was only embryonic, abstract in the preceding one. There is an historical reason. There was an acceleration of thought and communication, an unheard of immediacy and clarity of technique. This is an excerpt from George Steiner's Bluebeard's Castle, Notes for a Redefinition of Culture. It's a text which was published in 1971. It's from the first chapter. No string of quotations, no statistics can recapture what must have been the inner excitement, the passionate adventure of spirit and emotion unleashed by the events of 1789 and sustained at a fantastic tempo until 1815. Far more than political revolution and war, on an unprecedented scale of geographical and social compass is involved. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, La Grande Épopée, literally quickened the pace of felt time. Those who lived through the 1790s and the first decade and a half of the 19th century, and who could recall the tenor of life under the old dispensation, felt that time itself and the whole enterprise of consciousness had formidably accelerated. The decision of the Republican regime to start the calendar of human affairs anew with l'an 1 is an image of this great change. Even in the mind of contemporaries, each successive year of political struggle and social upheaval took on a distinct, graphic individuality. 1789, 93, 1812 are far more than temporal designations. They stand for great storms of being, for metamorphosis of the historical landscape so violent as to acquire almost at once the simplified magnitude of legend. Together with this accelerando, there occurred a growing more dance of human experience. The notion is difficult to set up abstractly, but it crowds on us unmistakably from contemporary literature and private record. The modern advertisement nostrum about feeling more alive than before had then a literal force. Until the French Revolution and the marches and countermarches of the Napoleonic armies, history had been very largely the privilege and terror of the few. Certainly in respect of defined consciousness. But these swept over the population with tidal mystery. It is the events of the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that interpenetrate common, private existence with the perception of historical processes. The levée en masse of the revolutionary armies was far more than an instrument of long-continued warfare and social indoctrination. It did more than terminate the old conventions of professional, limited warfare. As Goethe noted acutely on the fields, at Valmy, populist armies, the concept of a nation under arms meant that history had become every man's milieu. Henceforth, in Western culture, each day was to bring news, a perpetuity of crisis, a break with the pastoral silences and uniformities of the 18th century. Wherever ordinary men and women looked across the garden hedge, they saw bayonets passing. It is clear that the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutionary decades brought on an overwhelming immanence, a deep, emotionally stressed change in the quality of hope, expectations of progress, of personal and social enfranchisement, which had formerly had a conventional, often allegoric character of a millenary horizon, suddenly moved very close. The great metaphor of renewal, of the creation as by a second coming of secular grace, of a just rational city of man, took on the urgent drama of concrete possibility. The eternal tomorrow of utopian political vision became, as it were, Monday morning. We experience something of this dizzying sense of total possibility when reading the decrees of the Convention and of the Jacobin regime. Injustice, superstition, poverty are to be eradicated now, in the next glorious hour. The world is to shed its worn skin a fortnight hence. Don't misjudge or understate the Enlightenment. As light expands, darkness expands even further. The known unknown becoming all the more desirable. The unknown knowns, that which you don't realize that is at work in what you do, becoming more and more undecipherably important. Beethoven stood there. And these are crucial, these unknown knowns. because they are the codes of the classical language. They are the things we don't realize have an impact on us. Why does Beethoven's music strike so strongly in our hearts and minds? And why does it seem to lose its impact? Well, because we're now aware of the unknown knowns and the known unknowns. These would be things left to the license of the composer and the performer. Harmonic modulations, instrumental advancements. Beethoven built these free turning wheels on the already feeble shoulders of the unknown knowns of the classical code. The Romantic era was, you might advance, just putting on some clothes over those shoulders. And Beethoven's improvisatory skills are no coincidence here, because improvisation implies using unknown knowns, harmony, ornamentation, and toying with them, knowing them. And that raises a very important question to which I'll come back later. What happens in time, within time, when one doesn't know where one is going? Improvisation, to the eyes of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is the ultimate presence of humanity as a single and lonely entity, thrust along nature and the flow of time. Improvisation, even perhaps more in the 19th century, is also the voice of man, of children, of women, thrust about the mechanical advances of the world, in need of expression instead of production. Here's a quote for you. Sensations, percepts, and affects are beings whose validity lies in themselves and exceed any lived experience. They could be said to exist in the absence of man, because man, as he's got in stone, on the canvas, or by words, is himself a compound of percepts and effects. The work of art is a being of sensation and nothing else. It exists in itself. In a way, these works of art, those that stem from sensation, lift their own weight away from the composer. The work itself attains the dreamt of solitude and bliss of Wanderer. Beethoven was also there. He is also there in the mindset of improvisation as union with and separation from nature, from the world, and later from technology. And he is also in the dying wish that he'll thankfully be forgotten, cast aside by his own works. You see, art navigates, creates its proper coordinates of time. However, this solitude that the work of art has makes it all the more clear that there is an identification of man and time, humanity as the bearer of time. And flow, uncertainty, work is only skipping rocks, is only steps from one bank to the other. And that didn't just happen in Beethoven, but also in the other arts. There is something in Goya, for example, and his work on the proportion between the character, the personnage, the main action, and the ground, not the background, because time wasn't the background with Beethoven and Goya. It is the ground, but it was never seen before. It's an unceasing semiotic ground around which the creator has to create focus. If there is such a direct link between us and time, we have to aim for it. Since reason has dethroned God, and since classicism has found an avancée, classicism and the Enlightenment have found a step further from the Greek and Latin classics. These latter two trusted theory and logic, but the classicism of the 18th century, since the Renaissance, they trusted the advancement of life, the advancements of life, the advancement of proving a point. This meant that one had to go further and bring oneself forward in time, away from everyday nature and culture. Humanity as the controller of impulses around the world through culture and away from culture. Humanity and time, however they may be moving, as satellites, appendixes, supports to the work of art. We see art as the main thing around which humanity and our perception revolves, but humanity and time remain all the more unchanging in their view of one another, in that time will always be a harmful experience, a harmful presence in humanity's life. And from the point of view of time, we as mankind are the counter-agent to its own existence. The conflict between us and time, the perennial quality of this conflict is maybe not at the foundation of art, but at the foundation of leaving traces. This is another excerpt from George Steiner. the thrust of will which engenders art and disinterested thought, the engaged response which alone can ensure its transmission to other human beings to the future, are rooted in a gamble on transcendence. The writer or thinker means the words of the poem, the sinews of the argument, the personae of the drama, to outlast his own life, to take on the mystery of autonomous presence and presentness. The sculpture commits to the stone the vitalities against and across time, which will soon drain from his own living hand. Art and mind address those who are not yet, even at the risk deliberately incurred of being unnoticed by the living. There is nothing natural, nothing self-evident in this wager against mortality, against the common, unharried promises of life. In the overwhelming majority of cases, and the gambler on transcendence knows this in advance, the attempt will be a failure. Nothing will survive. There may be a cancerous mania in the mere notion of producing great art or philosophic shapes. Acts, by definition, free of utility and immediate reward. Flaubert howled like a man racked at the thought of that Emma Bovary, his creature, his contrivance of arrayed syllables, would be alive and real long after he himself had gone to a painful death. There is a calm enormity, the more incisive for its deliberate scriptural echo, in Pope's assertion that to follow poetry as one ought, one must forget father, mother, and cleave to it alone. For poetry, in that sense, one can read mathematics, music, painting, astrophysics, or whatever else consumes the spirit with total demand. Each time, the equation is one of ambitious sacrifice, of the obsession to outlast, to outmaneuver the banal democracy of death. To die at 35, but to have composed Don Giovanni. To know, as did Galois during the last night of his 21-year existence, that the pages that he was writing would alter the future forms of algebra and of space. Perhaps an insane conceit, using that term in its stylistic sense, but one that is the transcendent source of classic culture. We hear it proclaimed at the close of Pindar's third Pythian ode in Latimore's version. I will work out the divinity that is busy within my mind and tend the means that are mine. Might God only give me luxury and its power, I hope I should find glory that would rise higher thereafter. Nestor and Sarpedon of Lycia, we know men's speech from the sounding words that smiths of song in their wisdom built to beauty. In the glory of poetry, achievement of men blossoms long, but of that the accomplishment is given to few. Note the modulation from poetic action to aristocratic truth. It is not accidental. The trope of immortality persists in Western culture, is central to it, from Pindar to the time of Mallarmé's vision of the livre, tenté à son insu par quiconque a écrit, which is the very aim of the universe. The obsession is crystallized once more, memorably in Éluard's phrase, le dur désir de durer. Without such harsh longing, there may be human love and justice, mercy and scruple. But can there be a true culture? Can civilization, as we know it, be underwritten by an immanent view of the personal and social reality? Can it be vital without the logic of relation between the divinity that is busy within my mind and the hunger for a glory that would rise higher thereafter? And it is precisely that logic, with its inference of active afterlife, and in and through artistic intellectual creation, which is, and this relationship is religious. This logic and its idiom are now eroded. The notion, axiomatic in a classic art and thought, of sacrificing present life, present humanity, to the marginal chance of future literary or intellectual renown, grates the modern nerves. Going back to Goya, Beethoven, also improvisation, and trying to focus on the objective of experience and sense as a ground for life, we have to recreate the fleeting and relative sense of the arrow of time. Let me take an example. What was seen as repeatable or helpful for memory, like large-scale repetitions in the classical era, in classical music, was seen as absolutely unavoidable by Beethoven's time. And where some smaller musical units, such as themes, were, in Haydn and Mozart, stated once or twice in full length before a transition or a contrasting element, Beethoven slices the theme into motives and launches it in innumerable iterations, losing and strengthening the concept of identity for such a motif. He is stretching it in the micro or the macro. But the conflict of forms, of the understandability of form and the closeness that a Beethoven motif has to our emotions, it's close. That relationship changes in Beethoven's life, in his own creative life. In his heroic period, the conflict it's at the center of the work's parameters. There are great contrasts, immense gaps of meaning that you have to jump through to conquer the form, and there are nuclei of meaning. Either it's a fight, either form or fantasy can come out alive of, say, the Opus 59 string quartets. Maybe Opus 59 number 2 has fantasy having the upper hand, while Opus 59 number 3 has kind of a mix of both. But, as time goes on, Beethoven loosens the imprint form has on the work's material. Instead of form being tightly knit to its own constituents, it is wholly novel, completely new, without need of a particular undercurrent conflict. Therefore, in late Beethoven, we have the addition of movements, the elision of movements, of sections, of entire emotions. But this is just Beethoven finding a homely stead for his fantasy to walk about. Finding a strange world of curious coordinates and vectors, not for the arrow of time, but for the arrow of fantasy. He probably doesn't feel flow the way we do, and yet he wants us to experience it as he does. So, improvisation, this is about walking. It's about the pacing of experience. Maybe a deaf composer doesn't realize how much effort is put into performance by just looking at the performer. So that forces him to go deeper into the extremes of tempo. But, there is a flame here that has to blow strongly. And it's not just within the works, it's in between the works. The chronology of what happens in his life between 1803 and 1812 or 1811, that's absolutely not normal. It's a grave misconception of today that artists follow and get inspired by their times, by their zeitgeist. But on the retrospect of any era, it seems that art brings forth prematurely what is to happen in the world. To throw it in the world before it is fully formed there, before it can be translated into technology or efficiency. Trains didn't exist until the 1830s? Well, accelerando and ritenutos existed way before that. Just like the concept of evolution. You shouldn't deny art's ability to startle you. Beethoven's compositions probably startled himself before any other was startled by it. Hence his writing it, hence his working it out. Everything in this strange music is designed to mess with how we usually take in the world. The push and pull effect of rhythm on us. It's so strange. At each repetition of a motif, we feel both hurried and comfortable. And it's up to the performer to choose what he inflicts on your ears and your eyes. Eyes are important because they can signal the ultimate characteristic of Beethoven's music: fire. Figures of secondary importance to our ears, but maybe not to our craving of sense. Rumbling noises, chaotic restlessness, all of this giving life to structure around it, like a light glancing through a deep cave. Some of Beethoven's works and their endings, quite a few actually, end with dashes of light instead of music. We're not supposed to count individual pitches, to decipher rhythms and polyphony. Beethoven throws these away because that's not how impact works. Instead, it's just waves of light and sound particles putting an imprint of their velocity on you. Music? Puh, intangible. We may have scores, but there is no source to music. There is only direction. Hence also this sometimes nauseatingly aching feeling of having to leave a slow movement. Because direction of music and music, they don't care about us. And not, they don't care about Beethoven, but not just him, about us too. But you know what? Music as a whole needs these boundaries to movements, to phrases. Otherwise, how can it be remembered unless a theme bears structure and repetition? How can it stay in our mind? There is, however, one exception. The songful cavatina. There is a formless density that takes place in a completely subjective and arbitrary point of the work. It's absolutely hollow, and to me it's the musical representation of amnesia, and at the same time it's the embodiment of emotion, as I can feel it, because you crave for it. Music actually cares about you. It cares that you should learn from it. Beethoven's works are vastly different in architecture in that regard of direction and having to leave the experience of something than going to the next one. Observe, for example, why he would choose to put a slow movement after a moderately fast first one, or instead put a scherzo after the opening movement, or why sometimes he dismisses the idea of having a slow or a fast movement altogether, or even a last movement, or even a first movement. Why did he choose? Well, he didn't. The music dictated it to him. It's not about energy. I mean, of course it's about energy, because, the first movement of the Ninth Symphony has such a tension that we can't go straight to the meditation of the slow movement. We have to, let go some of the steam in the scherzo. You can't put everything in a sonata, in a multi-movement work. However multi it is, it must remain united and make its contradictions clear. The Waldstein Sonata's original slow movement, the Andante Favori, was much longer and characterful and lighter than the one we have today, which is quite plodding. But it didn't fit, according to Beethoven, the original one, because the other two movements around it are already dealing with light. And having long motifs in the second movement would absolutely ruin the blissful first statement of the last movement, spoiling us of the reward of listening to something sublime, something circumscribed. Beethoven doesn't play with us. He isn't perverse. He gives, but he means to give at certain moments. Hence, all those bare repetitions of entire sections to create in us a desire for not just momentum, but for newness. This creates a chaos in perception, the chaos of our perception and of our constant intake of the world. This engenders the order of the work. The chaos of the world necessitates the beauty of the work of art, the necessary beauty of fully formed order. That's necessitated by the line that we draw as human beings between our own perception and the world. This has an aura on the work that we're experiencing. Our experience, vice versa, of the work of art, it comes back through us unto the world. And our perception of the work of art echoes in the world of facts. And this helps us to bring our everyday lives ever further in the limits of meaning. Beethoven created for himself, for his own very peculiar rendition of the world, a very special intelligence. From the smallest axioms of perception, he drew the largest and most advanced results possible. Pierre Boulez has an interesting take on it, and I'll try and summarize it. So, ideas can be tested, experienced. We can see their evolution using tools. These tools develop and deduce further conclusions to the original idea, either bringing it towards modernity and new sounds, either towards the past, finding old ideas in new ones. There is a twist. The twist is that both these operations can be achieved using old and new means, new vectors of translation in music's parameters.
On a stage. Thank you, Mr. Boulez.
Speaking of which, the classical school has sort of a disdain for the microelement, dismissing it as work, preferring to it the lofty heights of drama or form. This changes with Beethoven, and he takes the smallest axioms to make the Missa Solemnis. And this isn't due to luck or talent, of course. The loneliest someone is, the furthest he'll return to his base perception. The rest is just, to be fair, sublimation. You daredevil Donnelly, I love your piercing lots of lies and your flashy foreign mail. So here's my county card. I dalgo with all my exes, wise and sad. Et toi, Donnelly, grand cryptomane, j'aime ta façon de percer de ta lance les mensonges et l'éclair de ton coursier rapide. Voici ma carte, ostraciste Hidalgo, chevalier de tout voir, tout entendre, tout dire à la triste figure. These characteristics as a composer, the extension of form to all parameters, micro to macro motions, irregular forms, what it comes down to is perception of time. Time was going faster at the time. Adorno was right. The older the music, the faster we ought to play it. And by faster, I don't just mean speed or drama. That would, add too much color to the whitened ruin. Instead, let's say that the travel of color is the experience of color. That's a beautiful quote, isn't it? It's from James Joyce, for whom conception of art is made only through experience, through actually two travels. Our own travel and the works, The travel of color is the experience of color. When he says experience, is it color experiencing itself? Or is it us experiencing color? Or is it us seeing color in ourselves? We seem to follow Nietzsche's intuition that we are sweetly parallel to each other, with art and the whitened ruins and the travel of color. Sweetly parallel. Well, that kind of harkens back to Beethoven, because with his tempi, he wanted us to have an overarching outlook on his work, to experience it with both a shade that wouldn't render everything and a pace that would render a sense of wholeness. He wanted us to take his chair. How can we take him for granted since he didn't take himself for granted? Beethoven goes further because he has a weird relationship to the very small elements, to individual notes and resonances, scratches, whiffs, taps, shovings, wipes. He can't hear them distinctively, yet it's the only thing he can hear by then. He knows these are a preponderant element, a molecule that will at one point run along the organism that is his work. That's why he's so attached to the power of attacks, because he knows that there is something extra, other than pitch, other than rhythm, other than harmony. The exigence of speed comes from this, to both integrate these scrapes and spiky sounds into the texture of the form and orchestration, and also to blur these very sounds. Of course, it will be strange to perform a work by Beethoven. It is always strange, because we can't hear distinctly. Yet, it's all part of the cathedral of sound. It's all part of a theorem, an equation of incompleteness, but meaningful incompleteness. The gargoyles, the functional ornaments, the colors. Colors do have a function. It makes the work breathe life. Beethoven was right. The greater the genius is, the more his descendants will imitate their failings rather than their qualities. Hence, the harm Shakespeare and Michelangelo have done to drama and painting, and the harm being done by Beethoven now. End quote. Composers cannot escape the past forever, claiming newness, while so much is unexplored in what we consider to be the light around us. This is a labyrinth, and whatever is at the center is very much alive, despite you trying to find a way out of it. This isn't one of those labyrinths, mazes, where you have to escape it, to break out the meaning of the work from its own grasp. But it's one of these old classic labyrinths where there is something precious that's precious at the center. It is at the center. It is at the center. I'd like to make one last observation, a rather despairing one, a frightful one, to be honest. There is a dissolve late in Beethoven's life, maybe a breaking free or a forgetting, meaning that what I just said was wrong about labyrinths, a leaving behind of his will in favor of his spirit. Because Beethoven doesn't just stop using con brio, but also the whole concept of scherzi disappear completely. Of scherzi and their entrancing and morphing repetitions. They disappear. The last one, it seems, is from the Hammerklavier, and it's already so broken up, so jagged, so unrelentlessly relentless, so antagonistic, so difficult to accept. It seems that we have a case in which a creator just lets go, because the scherzi after that are just not scherzi anymore. I don't know where the breaking point is in this temperament, where in his work it happens. Maybe if there is even a breaking line, maybe con brio and scherzi, they share something in that Beethoven brought them kind of too close to the sun, and yet kept using features of con brio and scherzi after the Hammerklavier. And as these forms to Beethoven turn obsolete, they gain an unforeseen vigor. Tragedy is realizing too late, or not realizing the power of a fact, of a complex. Beethoven doesn't realize fully the extent of deafness, in a way. He isn't able to find a face to his deafness, to the evil that is deafness, because it is so central to him. He has to use it unconsciously as a vector of creation, and try and sublime his symptoms through his work. His deafness doesn't have a face to him, though it has traits. It has lines, very much how our lives, our experience of the world, creates a line between the world and the work of art. That's the same with him, his deafness. His own presence on the world, however negative it may be, traces free trajectories between the inner and the outer deafness. This episode is about a man whose face has been taken off. Perception of the world. The world is more and more divided by seconds, nanoseconds, and therefore we discover the musical atom. Some time has passed now, hasn't it? I will not bring you back to 1802, nor to 1810, nor to anywhere in Beethoven's lifetime, because biography, events, and quotes can only get us so far back and so far forward. I do not reduce their value, nor what they bring to our understanding, because, sometimes a creator explaining his utopia while he hasn't reached it yet is a good indicator of his own ideas as ideals, of what was going on in his mind. Take Busoni, an already very interesting composer, who is interested as a composer in reproducing the tradition of classical drama through modern means and texts, and who as a writer has an entirely different vision of the world, in fact, stemming from the same conflict of emotions through new means. Here's a little story. A fairy-like invention. New York, April 1st, 1911. Wireless dispatch. That we today, on March 29th, already know publicly what is only appointed to leave New York as a wireless dispatch on the 1st of April will seem less mysterious to the reader after he has finished reading this dispatch. Compared with the discovery revealed here, this tiny anticipation of it seems a mere bagatelle. Note from the editor. An extraordinary discovery is announced from South Park Hill. Kennelton Humphrey Happensieg, the scientist domiciled there, who is highly esteemed in professional circles, but in no way celebrated, has succeeded, thanks to an unusual gift of sharp deduction, in arriving at far-reaching conclusions through comparatively simple experiments. Happensieg of late has been occupied with the preparation of a supersensitive apparatus intended for phonographic discs. The contrivance, which he has perfected at last, resembles at a first glance a drum disc with a supersensitive epidermis, and possesses the quality of combining the utmost delicacy with the most complete power of resistance, and is able to pick up noises which are inaudible or unintelligible to the human ear. Moreover, it has the power of dissecting complicated sounds into their constituent parts. The contrivance is so extremely delicate that when a hand is passed through hair, the crackling is distinctly audible. Light steps in the room are recorded by it. The slightest breath is impressed on it. Happensieg left his laboratory at 2 o'clock in the morning after he had completed a new and, as he believed, perfect disc, and entered it again at 6 o'clock after a short night's rest. He subjected his disc to an examination by means of a very powerful microscope constructed by him for this purpose, and discovered on it certain impressions which he could not account for. After he had separated the customary noises of the town at night, which he considered as secondary phenomena in this case, he found an accumulation of obscure diagrams, which were systematic, complicated, and at first unintelligible. On first consideration, they might have been of musical origin, although they showed only a remote relationship with the musical forms familiar to him. In any case, they must have come from a very great distance. At investigation as to whether within a 10-mile radius music might have been played that night and during those 4 hours, resulted in a negative answer. But the marks were imprinted, and the disc, when it was brought into rotation, sounded music without doubt, which, to the scholar's ears, however, remained as unintelligible as the diagrams had been to his eyes. This happened about 6 months ago. In between, Happensieg had been at the work incessantly, and his never-resting mind had succeeded in giving the solution to the riddle and bringing forward a new theory, which fills us with awe and astonishment and opens up the widest prospects. as the air needs an instrument to make its vibrations perceptible to our ear, so the air itself is only an instrument which transmits the not yet fully fathomed wavelengths. These original wavelengths, as Appensee recognizes, have the characteristic quality of being similarly effective in a time sphere as, for instance, wireless telegraphy in that of space. In time, its effect works as well backwards as forwards, and its intensity decreases correspondingly with the distance. Sound atmospherics put in vibration through exterior inputs continue in both directions. Its impressions will be passed on into the past as well as into the future. A scream fades away into tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and further in corresponding strength. Logically into yesterday and the day before yesterday also. Thus, through a chance not yet cleared up, a demonstration of music in the future seems to have found its way onto the supersensitive disc and to have impressed itself there. After laborious calculations, for which quite new estimation will have to be found, the origin of the phonographic marks might lie 20 to 300 years in front of us, according to Appensee's assumption. If one takes an average figure, 140 years is the result, so that music written on the disc lies about a century and a half in the future. Sounds from the trombones, like Aeolian harps, melt into a sound fog, and again are the voices out of the void, without audible beginning, disappear into the atmosphere of sound. Sounds as if coming from tinkling water and burning fire assume melodic form, appear and disappear. Intervals are apparently purer and show the aliveness of human breath in their gradations and combinations. Nature itself seems to sound, and we are tempted to suppose that this music never wearies and goes on creating from what is there into infinity. All further details and additions to this sensational discovery we will communicate to our readers punctually and conscientiously every